The Texas Indian Wars were a series of 19th-century conflicts between settlers in Texas and the Southern Plains Indians. These conflicts began when the first wave of European-American settlers moved into Spanish Texas. They continued through Texas's time as part of Mexico, when more Europeans and Anglo-Americans arrived, to the subsequent declaration of independence by the Republic of Texas. The conflicts did not end until 30 years after Texas joined the United States. Although several Indian tribes occupied territory in the area, the preeminent nation was the Comanche, known as the Lords of the Plains. Quote, "The territory, the Comanche area, was the most powerful entity and persistently hostile to the Spanish, the Mexicans, and finally, the Texans." This article covers the conflicts from 1820, just before Mexico gained independence from Spain, until 1875, when the last free band of Plains Indians, the Comanches led by Quahadi warrior Quanah Parker, surrendered and moved to the Fort Sill Reservation in Oklahoma. The half-century struggle between the Plains tribes and the Texans became particularly intense after the Spanish, and then Mexicans, left power in Texas. The Republic of Texas, which had increasing settlement by European Americans, and the United States opposed the tribes. The war with the Plains Indians was characterized by deep animosity, slaughter on both sides, and, in the end, near total conquest of the Indians. Although the outcome was lopsided, the violence of the wars was not. The Comanche were known as fierce warriors, with a reputation for looting, burning, murdering, and kidnapping as far south as Mexico City. They killed and captured so many Texans that Comanche became a byword for terrorism in this region. When Sul Ross recovered Cynthia Ann Parker at Pease River, he observed that this event would be felt in every family in Texas, as everyone had lost someone in the Indian Wars. During the American Civil War, when the U.S. Army was unavailable to protect the frontier, the Comanche and Kiowa pushed white settlements back more than 100 miles along the Texas frontier. Background: Texas developed in the region between two major cultural centers of pre-Columbian North America. The southwestern tribes occupied the areas to the west and the Plains tribes occupied areas to the east. Archaeologists have found that three major indigenous cultures lived in this region and reached the developmental peak before the first European contact. The Pueblo from the upper Rio Grande region were centered west of Texas. The Mississippian culture, a mound builder region, extended along the Mississippi River Valley east of Texas. The Mesoamerica civilization was centered south of Texas. The influence of Teotihuacan in northern Mexico peaked around AD 500 and declined over the 8th to 10th centuries. During the colonial era, members of new cultures entered and settled in the area, through competition for resources and power. They became adversaries. All were relative newcomers to Texas. Europeans began permanently settling in Texas around the Rio Grande and upwards toward San Antonio and El Paso. Starting in the late 1600s, they reached Nacogdoches around 1721. The Comanche had not arrived into the northern area of the state until roughly the early 1700s. They did not become the predominant nation in the area until the late 1700s, following the successful adoption of the horse. Most other Plains Indians had already arrived by the mid-1700s. Indians in Texas. Although the Comanche are by far the best known of the Indian Plains tribes living in what is now Texas, they were the last to settle in the region. Their allies, the Kiowa and Kiowa Apache, originated in the west but migrated to what is now West Texas. Tribes indigenous to East Texas include the Caddo, Kitsai, Tonkawa, Tawakoni and Wichita Indians, the Akokisa, Alabama, Artacopa, Karankawa, and Tamik lived along the Gulf Coast. Until around 1650, the Comanche were part of the Shoshone people living along the Upper Platte River in present-day Wyoming. The Comanche emerged as a distinct group around 1650. About this time, they acquired the horse, which allowed them greater mobility in their quest for better hunting grounds. Their original migration took them to the southern Great Plains, into a span of territory extending from the Arkansas River to central Texas. During that time, the population increased dramatically because of the abundance of buffalo, the use of the horse for hunting and fighting, the adoption of other migrating Shoshone, and women and children taken captive during raids and warfare. Ultimately, the warriors made such effective use of the horse that the Comanche became the most powerful Indian nation of the plains. First as Shoshone, their conquest took them to the Southern Plains. In the region, they separated from the Shoshone and emerged as a distinct nation. They developed imperialist customs by which they became the strongest Indian nation in the region. They based the warfare on speed and calculated violence, developing superb light cavalry skill. In raids, they captured so many children and women of their opponent Indian tribes, keeping and adopting them, that they dramatically increased the population. Those tribes who submitted to Comanche power were given latitude but had to provide food, lodging, and women as tributaries. When the Comanche encountered an entered conflict against Spanish colonists, they blocked Spanish expansion to the east from New Mexico and prevented direct communication with the new Spanish settlements north of the Rio Grande. In turn, the Comanche and eventually Apache allies launched deep raids, sending thousands and, at times, tens of thousands of warriors into Mexico. They successfully captured and enslaved thousands of Mexicans. Eventually, the numbers were so large that Hispanics made up nearly 30% of the Comanche nation. The Comanches were decentralized. They never formed a single cohesive tribal unit but were divided into almost a dozen autonomous groups. The 12 bands had as many as 45 distinct divisions. These groups shared the same language and culture but at times fought internally in ritualized combat, even as they cooperated at other times. In the 1740s, Tonkawa, Yojuanes and others settled along the San Gabriel River. The Tonkawa allied with the Bidays, Caddos, Wichitas, Comanche and Yojuanes in 1758 and attacked and decimated the Lipan Apache and the Mission Santa Cruz de San Saba. The Tonkawa continued the southern migration into Texas and northern Mexico where they then allied with the Lipan Apache. Also during the 1740s in the Southwest, Spanish settlers sometimes captured American Indian children. Often it was common practice to have the child baptized and then adopt them into the homes, where they were raised to be servants. At first the practice involved primarily Apaches and eventually Comanche children were likewise adopted as servants. Before 1750, the dominant Indian tribe in Texas were the Apaches. But this changed with the Comanche Conquest. Beginning in the 1740s, the Comanche began crossing the Arkansas River and established themselves on margins of the Llano Estacado. This area extended from southwestern Oklahoma across the Texas Panhandle into New Mexico. The Apaches were driven out in a series of wars, and the Comanche came to control the entire area, which became known as the Comanche area. This domain extended south from the Arkansas River across central Texas to the vicinity of San Antonio. including the entire Edwards Plateau west to the Pecos River and then north again following the foothills of the Rocky Mountains to the Arkansas River. At this point, the power and force of the Comanche was such that they were threatening to take over all of North Mexico. However, after driving out the Apaches, the Comanches were stricken by a smallpox epidemic from 1780 until 1781. As the epidemic was very severe, the Comanche temporarily suspended raids, and some Comanche divisions were disbanded. A second smallpox epidemic struck during the winter of 1816 to 1817. The best estimates are that more than half the total population of the Comanche were killed by these epidemics. In response to this devastating loss of numbers, the Comanche effectively united with the Kiowa and Kiowa Apache. After one Kiowa warrior spent a full season with the Comanche in 1790. For this single incident, the three tribes eventually effectively united. Fehrenbach believed the union came from the necessity to protect the hunting grounds from settler incursions. First, the Kiowa and the Comanche agreed to share hunting grounds and unite in war. The Kiowa Apache, as allies of the Kiowa, ultimately joined this alliance. Eventually, the three tribes agreed to share the same hunting grounds, and had a mutual self-defense and war pact. Europeans in Texas, Texan colonists, European and especially mixed-race Mexican colonists reached Texas prior to the end of Spanish rule. Colonial authorities did not encourage colonization in this area, as it was too far from the bases. The number of colonists was extremely limited, and they were always at risk of Comanche raids. By the early 1800s, as a result of the Comanche Wars, the Mexican Wars of Independence, and the collapse of colonial power, Mexican resistance to Comanche attacks had almost collapsed. In contrast to the neglected military capabilities of the Mexicans, authorities considered Americans as extremely aggressive in combat, and they were subsequently encouraged to establish settlements on the frontier, in present-day Texas, as a defensive bulwark to Comanche raids further south. Although most of these early Americans were ultimately killed, executed or driven from Texas by Spanish authorities during the Green Flag Republic, the Comanches' subsequent raids deep into Mexico showed the practicality of Americans in holding the frontier. Consequently, the new regime quickly recruited Americans, the first of which was Stephen F. Austin, who was given a Spanish land grant in Texas. When Mexico won its independence from Spain in 1821, its government continued to recruit Americans, as it wanted to develop its depopulated northern provinces. Early Texas colonization. Mexican Texas 1821 to 1836. In the 1820s, seeking additional colonists as a means of conquering the area, Mexico reached an agreement with Stephen F. Austin reauthorizing his Spanish land grants. That allowed several hundred American families to move into the region, as Austin used his network and government sponsors to spread the word of rich lands in Texas. Thousands of additional colonists from the United States flooded into the region, many illegally. Many had no interest in being ruled by the government of Mexico. In 1829, when Mexico abolished slavery throughout Mexico, the immigrants from the U.S. were exempted in some colonies or actively evaded governmental efforts to enforce this abolition in the territory. Under the change, many slaves in Mexico at this time were reclassified as indentured servants, with the long-term goal of freedom. Americans did not like this policy and also objected to the central government's actions in tightening political and economic control over the territory. Eventually these tensions resulted in the Texas Revolution. In 1821, while colonists were still welcome, José Francisco Ruiz negotiated a truce with the Penatucket Comanche, the band closest to the settlements in east and central Texas. Following the truce, he was able to complete a treaty of peace and friendship, which was signed in Mexico City in December 1821. But, within 12 months the Mexican government failed to pay the presents promised to the Penatucket, who resumed raiding at once. For the same reason, failure to pay promised tributes, the peace treaties signed for New Mexico broke down. By 1823 war raged the entire length of the Rio Grande. Most of the remaining Mexican settlements were destroyed. Only those in the upper Rio Grande were secured. Thousands of surviving Mexican refugees fled to this area. The Comanche pushed out or killed most Europeans and Mexicans in the region, except the European-American Texans. In 1824, the Tonkawa entered into a treaty with Stephen F. Austin, pledging the support against the Comanche tribe. The Mexican government negotiated additional treaties, signed in 1826 and 1834, but in each case failed to meet the terms of the agreements. Although such events would have proved catastrophic in early years as the Comanche raided towards Mexico City, the presence of American militias obstructed such attacks, thereby encouraging the Mexicans to become dilatory in payments. Because Comanche raiding was based on taking booty and captives, the proximity of American communities proved more fruitful to Comanche raiding. Although Texan military force was much stronger than previous Mexican colonists, the sheer rapidity of advance and large numbers of the raiders overwhelmed many of these early Texan colonization. For in 1826, Comanches had raided and burned Green Stewart's new town of Gonzales to the ground. Used to the more subjugated tribes in the eastern United States, Texan colonists were unprepared for the military power of the Comanche and Kiowa. The raids on the colonialists were so successful that they pleaded for aid from the national U.S. government. It tried to protect American colonists in Texas. Seeing an opportunity because of the relative isolation of the Texans from Mexico, the U.S. started its own diplomatic campaign, sending a noted American fighter to negotiate with the Comanche on behalf of the Texans. The U.S. sent Sam Houston to Texas in 1833 as a United States diplomatic representative to arrange a treaty with the Penatucket Comanche, recognizing this as a United States attempt to expand power at Mexico's expense. Mexican officials objected to having the American diplomat in their country talking to the subject Indians about a treaty. They declared Houston persona non grata and asked him to leave the country. During the entire period of 1821 to 1835, colonists had difficulty with Comanche raids. Despite the formation of full-time militia ranger companies in 1823, Tonkawa and Delaware Indians, enemies of the Comanche, allied with the new immigrants trying to gain allies themselves against these traditional enemies. The Comanche detested the Tonkawa in particular for allegedly being cannibals. As early as 1823, Austin recognized the need to have specific forces designated to fight the Plains tribes, especially the Comanche. They did not distinguish between Mexicans and Americans in the raids. Austin created the first Militia Rangers by hiring 10 men. They were paid to fight Indians and protect the colonial settlements. Soon the colonists organized additional ranger companies. After the Republic was created, this trend continued. Without the resources for a standing army, Texas created small ranger companies mounted on fast horses to pursue and fight Comanches on their own terms. Fort Parker Raid on May 19, 1836, a huge war party of Comanche, Kiowa, Wichita, and Delaware attacked the colonist outpost of Fort Parker. completed in March 1834, it had been regarded by the colonists as a strong point, sufficient to protect them from any Native Americans not observing the peace treaties. Elder John Parker had negotiated with local Indians, unfortunately for the immigrants, because these Native Americans were subject nations to the Comanche. The tribe did not feel bound to observe the peace. The killing of colonist militia at Fort Parker also resulted in the Comanche taking 2 women and 3 children as captives. The Parkers were well known, and the destruction of most of the clan produced shock throughout Texas. Survivors, especially James W. Parker, called for vengeance and helped to recover the captives. This event took place near the close of the Texas Revolution and Texan victory at the Battle of San Jacinto on April 21, 1836. Most Texans were busy trying to return to what was left of the former homes, and dealing with their own losses, as well as skirmishes with the retreating Mexican army.